There is a flow to history and culture. This flow is rooted in what people think, because what people think will determine how they act.
This is true of civilizations and also individual human lives. Humans have an inherent desire to understand the reality we find ourselves in, and that understanding takes the form of a big picture in our minds of what we imagine reality looks like, which is our view of the world, our worldview. Well, everybody has a worldview, and because it is foundational to our existence, worldviews tend to be held with some emotional feelings. Attack my worldview, and unless I have investigated the alternatives, thought things through, and have good reasons for holding a worldview, I may feel threatened by the attack that I might be wrong. Every person's worldview is formed from their own accumulated experiences, what they have learned from family, friends, the education system, and the general culture. Other terms for these imagined mental pictures of reality are philosophy, scenario, story, paradigm, even religion. All worldviews have assumptions and conclusions with some kind of reasoning or thought process connecting them. They can be well thought out, with clearly recognized assumptions, sound logical reasoning, and sensible conclusions. However, people do differ on the quality of their thinking processes. Worldviews can be very simple, just believing what somebody else said. Bias and social pressure can push us to embrace certain ideas over others. Worldviews provide answers for the three major questions that humans have always wondered about. First, origins. Where did we come from? Or how did things begin? This is what the creation and evolution controversy is focused on, and it is an emotional issue because how we answer this impacts how we will answer the other two questions. Second, purpose. Why are we here? This is why we question and reconsider what we are doing from time to time. And third, destiny. Where are we headed? Or how will things end? And this is why end times is a very popular issue for many Christians, and it is a topic with lots of speculation and confusion. Philosophically plausible major worldview options tend to be fairly limited. Something has always been, an eternal creator, or eternal matter. Once there was absolutely nothing, and now there is something. Everything came from an original something, like matter, or everything came from an original someone, like God. Keep in mind that people can believe or reject certain stories for a number of reasons, and sometimes it has nothing to do with the factual or logical validity of the story. Some stories are popular for nothing more than how well they are marketed and promoted, like propaganda or advertising for consumer products. Most people do not spend a lot of time mentally wrestling with issues like this. Some really do not want to think deeply about big worldview questions, consider options, or evaluate evidence, so they wind up believing whatever story they encountered first. There are several sources of worldview stories: family and friends, education and cultural belief systems, and our own imagination processing our experiences and influences. First, we learn ideas from our family and friends, and the quality of those ideas depend on their experiences, education, influences, and thinking ability. Next, we learn the dominant story promoted by our culture through education and the media. Those leading a civilization may intentionally promote a certain story and discourage other stories they do not like. The encouraged story will be presented as Well, this is what everybody, or all intelligent and reasonable people, believe. Discouraged stories will be portrayed as only ignorant, irrational, and anti-science people believe that. There are logical fallacies and devices of persuasion that have been used for centuries to promote and discourage certain ideas and to deceive and manipulate people. Some people hate God and religion stories because current culture says that all religion is mythology and falsehood for the ignorant and superstitious, or that reason and science have discredited God and the Bible. Some people have had bad experiences with church and avoid everything associated with it. Some people like atheism stories because there are no set moral boundaries on behavior. There's no accountability or final judgment for how you lived life, and gradual natural development stories do sound plausible, and they are endorsed within the public education system by smart, confident-sounding people with lots of college degrees who claim those stories are supported by lots of evidence. Big worldview stories are held by a measure of faith in the source of that story. Bible believers trust in God's existence, His supernatural intelligence and power, and that God inspired and authored the biblical story. Atheists place their faith in those who confidently imagine that physical matter, natural processes, and miracle-working time were capable of producing everything that exists. In Western civilization, the two major options are: in the beginning, God created man in His image, or, given enough time, natural processes alone turned inanimate matter into people. Take your pick, for they are both faith stories. You can test these over time against accumulating evidence and how well they work in the lives of those who hold them. When it comes to major options, first there's monism, and that's the belief that reality is made up of only one element. Eastern monism, represented by Vedic Brahmanism, believes the spiritual realm is real, while the material realm is just an illusion. Western monism, or materialistic naturalism, believes the material realm is real, in fact all there is, and the spiritual realm is just an illusion. The European Enlightenment embraced Western monism, and that's why they believe that physical matter is all there is. Natural processes alone have organized matter slowly over time into solar systems, planets, simple and then more complex life forms. They believe religion and a loving father figure God were simply imagined by ignorant, superstitious people because they were afraid of this cold, impersonal universe. Dualism is the belief that both matter and spirit are real. Christian dualism holds that the material natural universe exists within a larger spiritual realm. God is the creator of the material realm, which had a beginning in time, and the Bible tells us a few things about it. At any given time, civilizations have priesthoods to whom they look for the basic explanations of worldview questions and values. There was a time in Western civilization, in fact centuries, during which the most authoritative answers came from a theological priesthood influenced by the Bible. However, we now live at a time when the authoritative answers in society come from an academic priesthood, and they also have a set of sacred books from which they get their authoritative answers. When people holding different worldviews clash, they usually disagree over their conclusions, but given the assumptions and reasoning each person does, every person's conclusions make good sense to them. So don't just dismiss those who disagree with you as ignorant fools. Since our conclusions are the result of our starting assumptions and available evidence, we would make more progress by first identifying and evaluating the assumptions and the evidence which we're operating on. Changed opinions usually come from new information and/or encountering a new and better perspective, a way of looking at things. Honest, mature conversation accomplishes more than argument. because arguments get emotional, and we do not reason and think well when we're emotional. We either get defensive, or our ego says, I must win. Evaluating worldviews. Unless you are an existentialist and believe that everyone actually creates their own personal reality with their imaginations, meaning your imagination actually changes the shape of external reality, then there is an actual objective reality out there, outside of each person's imagination, regardless of how well we understand it. If that is true, then it's our job to realign our imagined worldview with all of the available evidence. Worldviews can range from Fantasyland, which has no connection with reality, and will deliver to us a lot of disappointments and confusion as we try to understand it that way, to Reality Land, in which what we picture in our minds corresponds closely to what is really there. When talking about worldviews or paradigms, I use the word imagination in the sense of the picture that forms in each person's mind as to what they think reality looks like, not necessarily fiction. That imagined mental picture could be 95% based on experience, observation, and evidence, with only 5% of it being speculation or intuition as to where we think that 95% is pointing. Or the mental picture or paradigm could be 0% observation or evidence-based and 100% fiction, but it is something that somebody really wants to believe. T.H. Huxley, Charles Lyell, and Charles Darwin presented the idea of humans evolving from an ape-like common ancestor in books published in 1863 and 1871. However, a century later, the authors of 2 books published in the Time Life Nature series admitted that those books were written without so much as a single piece of evidence to support the story. Huxley, Lyell, and Darwin were not offering a scientific explanation, but pure fiction, based on nothing more than a philosophical story that they really wanted to be true. 150 years later, the notion is widely promoted and believed to be a scientific story for human origins, but some honest experts admit that the story remains a mess, with no consensus among experts, which tells us that this is still a fiction that some people really want to believe, but not because the evidence points that way. The same is true of the notion that life arose from inanimate matter by natural processes alone, an idea that was also promoted between 1868 and 1871 by some of the same people who claimed early life was very simple and arose either in ocean floor slime or in a warm little pond. This was reiterated by a Russian biochemist in the 1920s. However, observation and evidence have never supported that story. And one Harvard-trained biologist admitted in 1954 that the spontaneous generation of life out of inanimate matter by natural processes alone was impossible. But to avoid the special creation story, he would believe in spontaneous generation anyway. In 2011, the Scientific American ran an article admitting that while this notion was still promoted to the public as the scientific explanation for life's origins, scientists still do not have a clue as to how that could have actually happened. Just because ideas are promoted as science does not guarantee that these are really scientific stories. Some people are so committed to promoting a philosophical agenda that they will label their passionately held philosophical fictions as science to mislead others into going along with it. Well, how can you tell if your worldview or picture of reality is true or at least close to it? Well, compare your story to what you observe and the good evidence that you're aware of. Be aware that some pieces of evidence will seem to fit in several different worldviews, so then you need to focus on the things that don't fit and find an explanation where everything falls into place. If a good number of observations and facts do not fit your story, then that is an indication that your worldview or story or paradigm is probably wrong. When things don't seem to fit, you may have the wrong story, or you may have a distorted interpretation of the pieces that don't seem to fit. On the other hand, as your worldview gets closer to reality, more pieces of reality will fall into place and make sense. This not only applies to understanding nature, but applies equally well to understanding the Bible, or any form of investigation. Worldviews are serious business. They are intellectual because we're trying to understand our existence in this larger reality. As such, we all embrace some foundational assumptions that are not fully provable, and then we reason from those towards conclusions that will guide how we live our lives. Our thinking can go off track in each of these areas. What if we embrace some erroneous assumptions, or do some careless reasoning, or produce faulty conclusions? Worldviews are also emotional, because we're basing our lives on those assumptions and how we reason from them, so our hopes and fears are tied into our thinking on these things. What if our worldview assumptions, reasoning, and conclusions are wrong? The prospect of being wrong, confused, wasting our time, and misleading others is scary. The stakes are high, and what we believe about life translates into how we live life, and that impacts other people more often than we realize. Well, thinking is serious business, but it is also something of an adventure. God gave us emotions so we can empathize and sympathize, but also minds so that we can think and reason and evaluate options and believe the best big picture of reality. He is a God of truth, who wants his people to worship him in spirit and truth, and he invites his people to reason with him. Romans 12:2 calls on Christians to not be fooled and pressured into the world's mold, but to renew our minds. 1 Peter 3:15 calls on believers to have reasons for their beliefs and be ready to give an explanation for why we believe the Judeo-Christian worldview is true. James 3:17 speaks of being open to reason. Christians have every reason for being truth seekers.